to make a quick thank you to you, Jennifer, for the most generous introduction. And I hope it's not too long before we have the opportunity to see each other in person again. And likewise, this is an extension of an invitation to everyone here in the room. I would like to thank the Postgraduate Students Committee and the organizing team of AN4AA for this opportunity to share some ideas in this address, and more importantly, congratulate all the presenters today for this amazing lineup. You know that it's a good programming when we can travel from Safavid carpet making all the way to Korean shamanism in one day, right? And mangroves thrown in into the good mix. But I guess I like to begin our conversation today by acknowledging traditional owners of the land, sea, and waterways on which we meet today. Particularly, I like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, where I am currently located, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Now, in many ways, the acknowledgement is not entirely unfamiliar to Malaysians of Chinese heritage, although it has taken a rather different form of reverence in Dato Kong shrines. The term Dato and Kong are both honorific terms, meaning an elderly figure in the Malay and Chinese language, respectively. In this sense, it is a tautology to say Dato Kong, to describe something as Dato and Kong in the same breath, since they mean the same thing. But what it shares with the acknowledgement we do here in Australia is that a respect is accorded to the genius loci, right, or the spirit of the land. And in doing so, there are dimensions of this folk practice that isn't just about worship, but it's also about acknowledgement of what was here before, and is the guiding spirit of country where the Chinese, as immigrant settlers in Malaysia, have found themselves. Now, I'm proceeding with a bit of trepidation in speaking to such a disparate group of researchers who are thinking about art through multiple disciplinary lens. It's probably easier, as you know, to present on one singular obsession rather than try to weave together a jumble of practices, from reading art history to making art to sustaining a curatorial practice, as something that's interrelated. And this is my first time actually doing so. But here I'd like to therefore acknowledge Caroline Espenshade, who is amongst our audience today, who has recently completed a most excellent master's thesis on the curator artist in Victoria at the University of Melbourne, bringing together much more empirical reading on the circumstances of wearing multiple hats. I had this pleasure of reading the thesis and thinking alongside it through my own practice. But I like to first start with this idea of outhouses in today's presentation before delving into the historian Shigehisa Kuriyama's concept of an archaeology of distraction, to reflect, I guess, on my own curiosity for seemingly pointlessness of specific cultural histories. And then I will try and identify a thread of inquiry from my own work that spans art historical research, curating to art making, before concluding with an idea mooted by perhaps a similar figure from our recent past, who also spans categories, the artist theorist and bureaucrat Ismail Zain from Malaysia, on what he calls syncretistic vision, in a lecture he delivered in 1980 titled Seni dan Imajan, or Art and Imagery, as a means to develop care for the imagistic power of art sustained through making, curating, and writing. So some time ago, I was drawn particularly to a temple in a town 30 minutes away from Kuala Lumpur called Klang, and that housed a female deity known simply as Datuk Fatima. Now, in the worship of Karamats, right, and this is the Arabic Malay word for a category of miracle workers or sacred sites of power amongst the Chinese community in Malaysia, Datuk Fatima bears a number of unique characteristics. She is identifiable as a female figure who wears a hijab and conforms to the ideal of a pious Muslim woman, even as she is invested with a crown that signifies her temporal sovereignty. Now, the temple is called the Palace of Supreme Peace and is listed as having existed before 1913. But in 1993, the original structure burned to the ground, spurring the temple community to replace it with the brick building which you see on the screen here today. This new building bears several interesting iconographic features which form a composite of different architectural references. Immediately striking is the three-tiered roof structure, a reference to the traditional tiered roof vernacular found in pre-20th century mosques across the Malay archipelago. At the same time, each sloping tier of the four-sided roof is capped with an upward curved ridge shaped in the tail of a swallow. The swallowtail spine is commonly found, of course, in Hokkien or Fujian architecture. And in addition, on the eaves of the second tier of the roof tier, two metallic board cutouts in the shape of an onion dome topped up by an arch flank the entrance of the main worship hall. What is referred to here is the Indo-Saracenic sort of like style, which was first introduced by the British colonial government in their new government offices, today known as the Sultan Abdul Samad Building in Kuala Lumpur. Now, what I was particularly interested in is whether we could frame the history of architecture of this temple devoted to Dato Fatima and the surrounding village in relation to a 1958 essay I was also reading alongside called Odd Houses by a German architecture historian, Julius Posner. Um, Interestingly, Posner has a interesting connection to Malaysia. Not only was he instrumental in setting up Kuala Lumpur's first architecture program at the Technical College, he was also actively contributing to the country's architectural discourse and was a key witness to the post-colonial transition of Malaya into an independent nation state in 1957. While architects saw their role in the 1950s as biding time by adhering to the belief or the principle of good design, odd houses offer a self-deprecating reflection on the follies of such ambition and attempts to underline the contradictions of what constitutes progress. And while Posner's approach was principally modernist, his approach to architectural history did not always embrace such similar teleological drive. So writing about these lovable oddities, as he called it, that were scattered throughout post-war Kuala Lumpur, the essay was an attempt to reconcile the kitschy quality of these modernist houses, in which Foster notes these houses are bad architecture, yet they remain interesting because they have a vitality. As funniest amongst them, amongst the strictly professional angle, the least consistent are also the happiest looking, unquote. In Odd Houses, what Posner did was to observe that the austere heroism of modern architecture treads a fine line between solemnity and the farcical. And he notes from what is called modernism to what is called contemporary, Kuala Lumpur's post-war houses displayed all shapes and fashions, and they are argued to be spaces that are not only meaningful on a personal level, but also one where meaning spills into the collective. For he said, for our odd houses, vital, proud, and happy remains something like a cherished possession. So therefore, here, rather than seeing modernity as or modernism as a set of predetermined characteristics and conditions, what the essay did was to explore the modern as a practice of elective affinity through which we may explore the heterochrony of uh, time in art history itself, right? So the design promiscuity of the temple of Dato Fatima in Klang in many ways affirms the seldom addressed principle of modern architecture, that building accommodates a range of permutative idioms rather than anchoring itself strictly to a set of defined principles. For the tiered roof was not only a Nusantara feature, it existed in a web of affinity that stretched from the Sri Lanka Buddhist temples to the Chinese pagodas. Equally, the Swallowtail Ridge was as much a Nanyang or South Sea, was part of the Nanyang Cumene, as it belongs to a Fujian or Southern Chinese, let alone Chinese. In turn, the Indo-Saracenic was not only an expression of British Imperium, Mughal or British Raj, but also the Imperium in Imperial, existing alongside the ciphers of monumental authority in the anarchistic networks of overseas Chinese temple that are described poetically until today as temple universes, which you see here. So it could be re-inscribed into this Miao Yu or the temple universe of independent sort of like Chinese temples that emerge alongside these other sort of like architectural sort of like monuments. In the, it is the composite principle that we find a cultural model that not only sustains multiple idioms, but also multiple concepts of time, contributing to what Christopher Wood and Alexander Nagel calls double historicity. So what is important to the villagers here is not that the fire gutted the temple in 1993, but that the temple, though newly constructed, had been there for more than a century. It is, after all, a happy and vital architecture, even if it is a bit odd. So to think in terms of oddity requires the development, I guess, of a sensibility that is a little off kilter, since by and large, any obsession we possess can be easily punctured by a general public perception that the very thing we may be obsessed by is kind of pointless. Uh, this is a comment made on Quora by a tourist who visited Kuala Lumpur, which I really like, where I spent 8 years of my life teaching prior to moving to Melbourne. By all accounts, the comment was glowing. Great food, colorful people, colorful in every way, from race to attitude. That's what the comment says, right? Traffic that moves, but also some interesting history behind some of the buildings or monument. But there is always a caveat. It's kind of pointless history. That's what the commenter said. It's history nevertheless, but it's kind of pointless. And it goes on a bit before concluding that KL is a city that's somewhat slow and fast at the same time. Okay, I constantly return to this comment with quite a lot of amusement, but also some admiration for the clarity it has brought to me of the kinds of history we often deal with as scholars of Asian art that aren't always working with the grand traditions of art history, right? So, what methods of what methods of accounting must we adopt to understand the object of our inquiry? Why bother with pointless history? Is perhaps is it perhaps something? This is perhaps not something unfamiliar to everyone here, where we are taught to ask in the way we write our thesis, present our arguments, or even funding proposals. We ask the very anxious, with great anxiety and with bated breath, what is really the significance of our research? So, in his 2013 lecture, the historian of early modern Japan, Shigehisa Kuriyama, makes a rather interesting case for an archaeology of distraction, in which he proposes that when cultural forms and concepts are adopted from one culture to another, these moments constitute instances of distraction. One striking example cited in his lecture is the phenomena of teji or borrowed words, where Chinese characters are taken to mean a similar but slightly different concept when deployed in the Japanese language. So, in this sense, what occurs is less of an attempt at translation on the part of the Japanese. Instead, they were distracted by the potential of the word to mean something that, while not altogether dissimilar, manifests slight variance to the original usage and meaning of the word itself. And I'm putting up an example here on the screen for you to sort of like consider how the word Singson itself is then sort of like translate and when it enunciated and in different iterations in the Japanese language, it means sort of like different things according to Kuriyama. And I like to think along this line because distraction is in many ways the zeitgeist of our contemporary age of doom scrolling. I myself find sustained concentration increasingly challenging, and I do wonder for those who are embarking on their postgraduate research today, how do you actually sort of like sustain concentration? How do you sort of like maintain sustained concentration when it comes to reading and thinking, if that is possible at all? At the same time, what Furiyama's lecture suggests is that perhaps distraction forms the core of how we think in the first place. In this sense, rather than think thinking in terms of influence, for example, how can we reframe the question to consider what Thai contemporary artists say Montian Bunma is distracted by when he's creating Venus of Bangkok, right? Or to put it another way, in my colleague Roger Nelson, in his recent exhibition, that he's curated called The Unfaithful Octopus, Image Thinking and Adaptation at the ADM Gallery in Singapore. He was borrowing a conceptual device of the octopus from theorist Mike Ball, who, according to Ball, uh, uh, the octopus's main body is a interesting contemporary vantage point from which its cunning limbs can grasp and draw in an array of sources and timelines and contexts. Uh, and in doing so, and I quote that curatorial text here, all the artworks in The Unfaithful Octopus can be considered adaptations, meaning that they respond to stories that artists have taken from elsewhere. They're deliberately unfaithful kinds of adaptations, meaning that they use their artistic license to freely change the look and feel of the stories that they're responding to, unquote. And I wonder if we can also sort of like think alongside this idea of tentacular sort of like thinking of reaching out to different sort of like sources and responding to them in a very unfaithful manner as a distractive sort of like strategy and quality. And more importantly, propose that such a distraction is a shared methodological possibility of thinking across the disciplines that we're all sort of like, wedded to in pursuit of what may seem pointless, but may be our only resource in making a life out in this leviathan that we call academia meaningful. Okay. Because of my disciplinary training, my exploration often begins with art history. So, in this instance, I'll start by talking about my academic exploration of the Borea, which is a performing arts recognized by the state government of Penang as quintessential to its historic port city heritage. So, what you see here is an attempt to map out the different Borea troops across the city of Georgetown during a 1919 early 20th century performance season. Borea originated from an Islamic ritual and carnival procession held during the 10th day of the Islamic New Year in the month of Muharram. The Muharram celebration, or Ashura, was observed in numerous 19th century port cities around the world, including Penang, Singapore, Aceh, Bencoolen, Fiji, Trinidad and Tobago, and all the way to Sydney, right, Australia, amongst others. It went by various names such as Asura, Taja, Jose, Tabut, or Asan Hussein. And the festival traced its roots really back to the movement of South Asian native infantry, or the sepoys, exiled convict laborers, or indentured workers, as they sort of like circulate within the imperium of the British Empire and beyond. Within the Shiite Muslim tradition, this Islamic New Year commemorates the martyrdom of Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, at the Battle of Karbala. This event led to a theological division between the Muslim community into two main denominations, namely the Sunni and the Shiite. And but this division was never always sort of like rigid, especially before the 20th century. So what I was fascinated by is that a large part of the Boreas heritage discourse rests on a series of disassociation because of the Sunni majority sort of like population of Malaysia. The disassociation sort of like starts by disavowing its sort of like foreign origin, its Shiite roots, its past criminal sort of like associations, and its injury to sort of like Malay dignity because it was a festival that became also a refuge for many cross-dressers, surprisingly. And part of this litany also includes the purification of Borea as an art form by distinguishing it from a set of activities recorded as taking place during the day called Kolikalan, right? It is supposedly a translation from Tamil of the word foul thief or a chicken stealer, and in many cases caricatures this rude and debased other that the Borea tries to then define itself again, right? So if the Borea took place at night, the Kolikalan mischief involving this masked individual with blackened face who would beg, cajole, and steal in broad daylight was it's sort of like other. And if they weren't masked, then participants would sort of like have their faces smeared black. And what's interesting is visual instances of this masked and black-faced children have been documented in photographs, including the ones that you see here from Solo in West Sumatra from the late 19th century. This photo exhibits several elements that becomes recognizable when identifying the iconography associated with Muharram celebrations. So what you see is that you have elements that uses this sack mask over here. This figure here has this sort of like sack mask on it. It's the practice of applying black base paint and the construction of this tower-like sort of like structure referred to as the tabut, symbolizing the tomb of the Islamic martyr, right? That was then paraded through town. Now, clues found in the 1980, 1832 survey on Islam in India, known as Kanun-i-Islam, which includes a section dedicated to masquerade characters commonly featured in the Muharram celebrations, may shed some light on who this blackface character is, right? This chicken stealer is. Here it seems that the blackface character is linked interestingly to a story that was once beloved but is now largely forgotten across the Malay world. That of the story of Layla and Majnun. Now, Layla and Majnun can be considered the pre-modern counterpart to Romeo and Juliet in the Indian Ocean region. In this epic love poem of Persian origin, the male protagonist, Majnun, whose name translates to one who is possessed by the jinns, is prohibited from marrying his beloved. This prohibition leads him to an emotional unraveling, with Majnun wandering the desert, adopting a disheveled appearance, blackening his face, and donning ragged clothing. It is primarily this tragic and almost comedic sort of like image of an unattainable love that children adopted as a mask for their mischievous antics. In a way, Majnun embodies the intense and passionate emotions that appear all the more irrational when associated with prepubescent sort of like children who could hardly be expected to possess such adult experiences, right? But the allure of the Muharram celebration partly stems from its Saturnalian character. In an intriguing scroll depicting Muharram festivities in Tamil Nadu, South India, from the early 19th century, currently in the Asian Civilizations Museum's collection in Singapore, it provided a glimpse into the spirited and rowdy revelry that characterized this festival. Painted on an elongated horizontal scroll, the artwork guides the observer along the lengthy processional route, with different sections of the scroll unveiling various characters, some of whom can be identified from the Kanun-i-Islam. But what is interesting is that several of these characters and iconographies are not unfamiliar to the Muharram celebration in the Malay world. And part of my research is to sift through the company paintings, photographs, and scroll paintings to prove a close visual connections between Muharram festivities, specifically in South India, to those of the Malay world itself. And in this sense, life in the bustling port city often teetered on the edges, right? And the hopes and of migrants and wanderers for a better life were often infused with elements of sort of like tragic comedy. And this was something that I was sort of like trying to find out about Penang in the early and 20th century, where we have where we could sort of like situate the Muharram and Borea and use that to situate the island within a larger historical sort of like network of trade connected to an Indian Ocean's cultural modernity, characterized by the liquidity of its ownership, adaptive nature of its form, and the plurality of its practice. So, for my research into the Muharram came an opportunity to delve further into some of its early modern resonances to explore what Abby Warburg, in another context, calls the Nachleben of, antiquity or the afterlife of antiquity. And in this instance, my interest turns to the afterlife of, the Indian Ocean world. This opportunity came in the form of art making for Parasite Hong Kong. It's exhibition called An Opera for Animals, curated by Cosmin Costanas and Claire O'Shea, in which I worked on the idea of creating an atlas Nemesis for the Indian Ocean, with a staging consisting of three parts. Firstly, three sets of hand-cranked whirligigs depicting characters from the Muharram procession, and these were characters that you see here that were based on the Madras scroll painting of the Muharram procession, which I showed earlier in the collection of the Asian Civilization Museum. The display was accompanied by a broadcast of an 18th century Malay song composed by British East India Company navigator Captain Thomas Forrest, set to the tune of the Corrente Vivace in the third sonata of Baroque composer and violinist Arcangelo Corelli. Performed by early music ensemble based in Kuala Lumpur, Wicked Music People, the song sets a tone of longing for the artwork titled The Tiger and the Navigator. And these refer to a pair of figures depicted on one of these whirligigs, uh, which you see at the far end here, the tiger and the navigator character here. And lastly, a kind of image wall sort of like surrounds this whirligig as serving as a backdrop for a story of colonial encounters in five acts. Now, without, I guess, because I don't have a lot of time, so I won't go so much into the content itself, but want to underscore from this exhibition is that it gives visualization to a methodological approach in how I often build iconographic and thematic connections across subjects. And in this instance, by signing off as Salman bin Soon rather than my name, Simon Soon, and learning how to compose Shiite poetry as part of the exercise. As a point of provocation, I was also interested in asking whether if it is possible at all for practice-led research to have a different kind of starting point than one of one's own cultural identity, right? Is the most authentic version of oneself always the culture that one is born into? This is a question I like to be in conversation, especially with other practice-led researchers in the room, as I must admit that I actually do not have any formal art making sort of like training, and this is something that I constantly sort of like think about whether it is possible to play others without without falling into sort of like the discussion of cultural appropriation, right? A very sort of like narrow sort of like discourse on what cultural appropriation sort of like means, and must the recourse always be back into one's own cultural sort of like identity? So, but instead, what you see here is that the method of consolation, of bringing together different sort of like things in conversation in relation to one another to tell a story is perhaps more familiar to curators who are used to the exercise of juxtapositioning objects across spaces to tell a story. And therefore, I like to reflect also a little on a 2022 project I was involved in called Sekolah Gambar, Enrique de Malacca, which is the fourth iteration of the Enrique de Malacca Memorial Project by artist Ahmad Fuad Osman. Now, the project was previously exhibited in the Singapore Biennale, the Sharjah Biennale, and then later on in his mid-career solo exhibition at the National Art Gallery in Malaysia in 2020. That was the last time it was shown. But the staging in 2022 I was involved in was specific in that we needed to respond to the celebration of the 500-year anniversary of the celebrated the circumnavigation around the world, right, in 2022. Specifically, the exhibition confronted this first navigation around the world by the Magellan Elcano expedition in 1519 that has over time gained allegorical significance, marking the start of the age of globalization. And yet, in popular celebration, the story of heroism, tribulation, and adventure is primarily told through an Eurocentric or Western-centric lens. Records show that amongst the 270 crew members who undertook the perilous 3-year-long expedition journey on 5 ships, was actually an enslaved Malay sailor and interpreter named Enrique de Malacca, or Enrique from Malacca. That was the He was subsequently baptized, and so that was the only name that we have of this person. And this insight offers us an opportunity to revisit this historical moment through the perspective of a person from the Malay archipelago, right? So what the exhibition did was what Ahmad Fuad Osman did was to draw on historical. What we did in this particular exhibition was to use the historical but presently unused Malay terminology for museum called Sekolah Gambar, or what it translates to is the picture school, right? Repurposes a local interpretive frame to question the standards of museological process, its authority over interpretation of the past, and the legitimization of grand historical narratives. And what the artifacts then assemble together this for display. What is interesting is that it possesses a diverse sort of like set of provenances. Some are actually historical, some are very tenuously linked, some are reproduced, some functioning as stand-ins, and others are simply fabricated, speculative, and fantastical. Okay. While the museological enterprise grew on the speculative, Ahmad Fuad Osman's creative approach is, of course, informed by historical thinking. The artist directs us to pay close attention to the different voices, claims, meanings that images and artifacts can activate. By assembling and staging a wide variety of gambar or images, the artist draws on the collage principles that underpins the museum's display operation to reveal the contested meaning-making processes that underlie the legacy of Enrique. And what was interesting is that due to the intermittent travel restrictions during the pandemic, the entire exhibition was realized through the collaborative use of a digital sort of like form of atlas nemesis known as Miro, perhaps familiar to many educators here in this room. So as we were trying to figure out to make how to make this different from previous iterations in Singapore, Sharjah, and National sort of like gallery in Malaysia, we very quickly realized that if it were to be staged in Malaysia, it couldn't simply repeat the well rehearsed hero's journey with a cosmopolitan Malay protagonist for a global audience. It couldn't be so cookie cutter and simplistic in that way. Instead, the context of its staging requires a lot more nuancing, given that Malayness colored with a very narrow nationalist identity discourse in Malaysia itself requires a bit of unpacking, right? So moving therefore beyond the simplistic binary of East versus West, what we did with Scholar Gamba is to explore how images itself were powerful containers of memories, visions, and ideas that do not simply represent but actively shape historical consciousness. In doing so, we structured the exhibition along four important touch points to think about hybrid cultures in the Malay world along four nodes, namely creolization, right, and hybridity, picturing or representation, and how the idea of high seas as a kind of like fluid world of literal cultures, and finally thinking about the afterlife of such ideas in terms of its contemporary resonances. And in doing so, what the exhibition did was also to explore the contours of history writing and to understand the shared values and competing claims of Enrique's identity and geographic affiliations, not just in Malaysia, but across Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. By way of conclusion, therefore, I like to leave everyone with some thoughts on the 1980 lecture delivered by Malaysian artist, theorist, and curator, who was formerly director of the National Gallery and the National Film Development Corporation, Malaysia, on the topic of art and imagery. Now, in the east, in his writing, and I quote him here, yeah, in the east coast of the Peninsula Malaysia, Around the month of October and November, depending on when the monsoon season begins, one sees an arching seeding wave of clouds rolling in from the South China Sea, heading towards the beach. The traditional community of the East Coast often connected in the shapes and forms of the incoming cloud, flooding the sky that is still presently blue with the imagery of the procession of Sema and his military cavalcade. Unquote. Shore to shore, like the near intervisible line of the horizon intimated in Hayati Mokhtar and Dane Said's 2006 four-channel video, images form when we abide with time, and it helps to conjure dreamily, and they conjure dreamily against a backdrop in our slow reckoning of place. The figure of Sema in Wayang Jawa, patronized by the Kelantanese court, is often recognized as that indigenous regional clown or trickster figure introduced into the epic cycle of South Asian origin. It is a figure who embodies liminality between posing poles, male-female, wisdomful, divine profane. As a hermaphrodite, Sema is both servant and counselor to the hero of the tale times, but also recognized as an incarnation of divinity in his own right. For Ismail Zain, the appearance of Sema in the form of the rolling clouds to the people of on the peninsula, on the East Coast Peninsula, signifies a moment of recognition. Here is an example of how a cultural community is able to identify new visual patterns as they learn to see from the natural world through language or mythology. And in this sense, what Ismail Zain suggests is that this acquired vision are produced often through what he calls perceptual psychology or the chance image in his lecture. By ending his lecture with this dramatic imagery, Ismail Zain is in turn summarizing what he has been trying to do with the lecture that carries the title Art and Imagery. For the lecture appears on first impression to be ambitious, sprawling, and non-conclusive. A number of ideas prevail, principally privileging the local over the nation, prospecting of cosmologies instead of country, and instead of advancing a theory about Malaysian art, the lecture itself locates the condition in which artistic vision is able to fulfill a kind of understanding that he calls syncretistic as opposed to analytic. So as you can see here from this example from the book published in commemoration of the lecture, he marshaled examples ranging from cave paintings to Dongson drumwares to Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, from Zen paintings to rock art inkblot test cards. What his cultural reference not only span geography and time, they also span the neat divisions of art, craft, and popular culture. In turn, this store of cultural resources was viewed as the inheritance of the contemporary artist. And by exploring vision, giving emphasis to the psychological process in which one sees a spirit or an animating force in a tree or a rock or a cloud, Ismail Zain is suggesting that how we learn to see in this context is responding to a very different type of pattern recognition principle. In the lecture, he used the word syncretic to describe this mode of vision. For Ismail Zain, such a vision is characterized by the reception of wholeness because it is multifocus without the need for the analytical, in which visual concentration is directed in one specific spot. Instead, it is an all-over effect with the aim of embracing everything at once. Learning to see the world in syncretic terms also then leads to the recalibration of our understanding of when is art and what is culture. In doing so, what Ismail Zain proposes is that the reimagination of creativity contributes to the critical undoing of the power of modernity and coloniality in overdetermining the production, reception, and redistribution of art and culture. So, in this sense, is it our belief in the imagistic power of art and objects a form of distraction? Is something that I want to ask. And is it because we hold on to certain belief in letting things talk to us in different registers that we might perhaps be led astray towards the seeming pointlessness of art and its histories that form our individual and singular obsessions. I end with this consideration by Patrick Flores, shared in a meeting in Bandung around 2013, for us to think together, not to give some finality to my presentation here, but to make space for our conversation, for the capacity of sense perception, in perhaps distracting us from the common sense and the commonplace, complacent reading of art and culture in relation to history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for such a generous talk. And um, it was so fantastic and fascinating to hear the way you draw upon very seemingly disparate threads and ideas and images and objects. So that was such fascinating to listen to. I would now like to invite everyone to, whether they're in person or tuning in online, to join in the discussion with Simon. If you had any questions, please pop them in the chat and we're happy to read it out. Or if you'd like to vocalize your question, put your hand up. More than happy to facilitate that. And anyone in room as well, if there's any questions. But while we're kind of waiting for them to come through, I I, I did have a question for you, Simon. And you're describing this kind of methodology to us as a kind of a way or a strategy of thinking through distraction, of tentacular thinking, to quote Roger's quoting of Baal. And as a kind of strategy, like a productive strategy, this very productive inventiveness, drawing upon, seemingly random threads. And I wonder if you can reflect more about form and, how do these webs of, very complex connections emerge and come to light and find form. And you worked across the exhibition format, you've worked across like academic publishing, and so and so. And are there forms that just lend better to this way of working, or do there need to be forms made? Yeah.
Lend better to this way of working. Okay. Thank you for the question, Jennifer. I've not thought that specifically about whether there are forms that led specifically to this way of working, because it's um very often it's a very intuitive process. What I want to sort of like foreground in our uh, i- i- in the way we sort of like put up a very rational and methodical sort of like front when we're presenting our research, is that very often our research is guided by intuition. It's guided also by serendipity. It's also guided by a lot of like accidents and opportunities that suddenly sort of like open up, right? And I felt like maybe that should also be sort of like given credit, even as the output that we often sort of like hear in the form of, say, a conference presentation. It tends to be a lot more sort of like systematic and logical in nature. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah. I don't I haven't really sort of like thought that specifically about whether you know there are specific forms that lends better to this way of working or not.
There is a comment in the chat from USU, and I wonder if
Oh,
USU would like
take
to.
the slides down. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Yeah, I wonder if USU would like to unmute, but that's okay if not. But USU is kind of asking if you might have thought about relationally to sites in Iran, in Konya, but
Uh,
maybe you can
yeah.
also.
In my thank you. Yes, yes. VSU. Definitely. My focus is specifically on Penang or the Malay world, but in my larger map that I have created, I did also in some ways map out, representations of the Tazia and Ashura across Iran and is it Konya or Kenya, right?
Oh, yeah.
Referring to
Yeah, that
Konya.
is about Samo and the Sufi dance mostly that I think you referred to that, but it was a bit different from what you showed. So it
Yeah,
is still going on. I mean, the interesting thing is about it is still a big celebration in Iran, and each region has its own, practice. It's
yeah,
very different from city to city, and
yeah.
this is still going on. I mean, it might be interesting for you to see how it has changed in the modern life,
Yeah,
the kind of practice.
no, thank you for that. I mean, it's one of my wishes to actually sort of like see a Taziye performance in Iran someday. I have been to Iran, but I've never had the opportunity to actually witness one.
Yeah, it should
But
be in that specific period, like in
yeah,
Mohammed, only 10 days.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and what I'm fascinated by, it's also its sort of like global resonances, and I believe now in both Sydney and Melbourne there are Ashura sort of like processions that are being held across the city in Australia itself. Am I right?
Yeah, I think it's not compared to what is happening actually there. I haven't seen
Of course.
Tazia. I have seen some onshore practice, which is mostly by, I'm not sure if I'm right, but by Afghan people rather than Iranians. But it's a big celebration. Also, you mentioned about tiger, if I'm right, about South India. And it was interesting because in Iran, the animal that is like, it is symbolic, it's lion rather than tiger. And that was very interesting to see how it has changed.
Yeah, so it's used interchangeably, right? Once it came to India and then also to in Southeast Asia, the lion, the throne of lion, the throne of lion, which is Ali, then became the tiger. The tigers then became the sort of like the replacing symbolism, and it's fascinating that you sort of like brought up how interchangeable these the tiger and the lion is in this context. This is Allison. Should I read the question? My question is in bringing
Yeah.
the complex historical narratives in the exhibition Tiger and Navigator. Did you think of working with contemporary artists to continue and extend on these ideas? Uh, you mean as a so I'm gonna guess that the question from Allison is that you're asking whether I'll work with contemporary artists in my capacity as a curator. Am I right? I've not thought about it, but
Yes.
yeah, I've not thought about it, but definitely that's a possibility. Uh, but I'm more curious what motivates that line of questioning. Is that something that you found to be, to have certain potential and resonances with certain artists who are working on, early modern history?
Oh, well, I just feel like it's such a rich area to be exploring. And I wondered if you'd thought about or you'd come across any artists um, that would would align with some of your thinking, some of those sort of contemporary ways of working that continue to push the some of the fairly fixed narratives that I've also come across in Malaysia, um, into a different space that is able to bring new insights, the sort of insights that you're exploring. So I wondered if
Mm,
you'd come across any artists or actually had an interest of working with artists in that way, that
uh,
align with your work. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the question, Tammy. Thanks, Alison. Maybe there is an artist by the name of Tan Hao, who I'm whose work I'm quite taken by, who works at the intersection of sort of like different languages and also the politics of language, right? Which then sort of like extends also into the early modern sort of like period. But perhaps someone who works whose body of work has created a body of work that is most closely related to, I guess, what I was exploring in the Tiger and Navigator sort of like story is this Singaporean artist by the name of Ho Zhen, who you might have heard of before. I've recently sort of like come away from his solo exhibition at the Singapore Art Museum and realized, hey, we're basically talking the same language. And how come I've never sort of like seen that work before? Whereas until recently. So that I think there are certain perturbations that ev- uh, each of us in our individual capacity are sort of like, picking up on. Yeah, thank
Okay,
you.
thanks.
Maybe let's go to Michelle because Michelle has her
Yep.
hand raised, and then we have a question in room here in Sydney.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks so much, Simon. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure we don't have, okay, echo. Can you hear me now, Simon? And everyone?
Yes,
Okay,
very
excellent.
clearly.
Thank you. Thanks for bearing with the tech. I think we're good. We're good. Oh, you can't hear, of course. Sorry. Okay, try again. Thanks so much, Simon. You gave such a rich talk there. So many things that you've given us to think about, and certainly myself to think about. One of them clearly is whether it's as postgraduates or other researchers here to be constantly sort of, I suppose, pushing the boundaries of our, strict disciplinary work by looking, beyond and to take on these distractions in the language of your paper. And, excuse me if I don't have a fully formed question here while I'm still thinking the various threads that you distracted me with here today, so to speak. But yeah, one of those things, what a brilliant comment that came through with the social media there that you gave to us to think about. I mean, one of the things I thought of too with that was, well, by what criteria is that person, judging Malaysia's history to be deemed pointless? And is that another question we need to, be asking here? Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about, and particularly, I suppose, because you did draw on the Malaysian curator, theorist work, Ismail Zain. Excuse me. I was thinking about, and I hesitate to bring the term up, but I was thinking about the currents of the discursive currents of postmodernism that were very much kind of alive, at the time of that piece by Ismail Zain. And I can't help but think, of course, of postmodernism, some strains of it as precisely this invitation to take on, various different threads in a way, and to bring them together without going too much more into it. As I said, I don't have the fully formed question here, but just a teaser there. Did that come into? Does that come into some of the thinking that you're doing about a more current present day practice of distraction, if I can put it that way?
Right. Yeah, thanks, Michelle.
Just a moment, Simon. We
Yeah,
need to unmute in our room here.
sure.
Thank you.
I kind of feel like you're, in a much better place, Michelle, in Monash to enact this kind of like undisciplined sort of like way of thinking. I'm in a much more conventional sort of like institute, right? That tends to sort of like, follow, what disciplinary sort of like logic, and somehow sometimes I feel it like an imposter at times. But on that point of that that social media post about pointless history that I saw, maybe it's a case about sort of like embracing pointlessness in the first place, and I see that as a very sort of like generous invitation to I rather than an affront, I see that as quite a generous invitation to think about, hey, it's okay to have this sort of like singular obsessions that no one else is really sort of like no one else really cares about. Because as long as it makes my life meaningful, that's sort of fine. um and I hear you on that sort of like point about postmodernism and trying to sort of like make sense of it. Only because I think the word, I guess, Ismail Zain, at least in this particular lecture, he didn't really sort of like, connect his idea to postmodernism, but he did speak about post-structuralism, which I guess is related, right? But I think what's exciting for us today is, yes, I think we are in many ways inheritors of this legacy, but we have much more sort of like poetic sort of like ways of reckoning with this idea of this playfulness, right? I like in other contexts, I like to use the word main in the Malay language, right, which is often used for theatre making. Right, it wasn't called theater, or it wasn't called drama in the past. It was called permainan or main. Right, you play act, you take on or assume the role of another. Right, you become something else altogether, and this is something that is often sort of like permissible. Right, and these sort of like poetics I found are quite generative, similar to this idea of the tentacular, for example, right, or distraction, or adaptation, or just simply being piratic in different. I think the way we are giving ourselves space to pluralize the way we think about this postmodernism is also sort of like trying to decenter it from a very sort of like specific um, center of knowledge production to think more playfully and more affinitively with other sort of like language and conditions that allow for this playfulness to also emerge.
Mm.
I'm conscious of time here, but is it okay if we just have one last question?
Hi, thank you, Simon.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah, if there is time, I was interested in your idea of syncretic as a method for challenging the way that art history is written. And if you could expand on how that is also, if you apply this in your curatorial work, and how this alternative way of doing may also be at use in curatorial projects and your exhibitions.
Okay, thank you. So maybe just to sort of like rewind a bit, and maybe I sort of like skip through that point, but I think at some point in my lecture, I did show us an example of like the mirror board, right, that I use to curate an exhibition, just because we can't sort of like be there on the ground. But I think it's a kind of nice visualization of what's going on in any curator's sort of like head. In any case, it's just not my methodology, but in other contexts, curators would use the word constellative or constellation to describe this process of juxtapositioning things and letting sort of like a meaning emerge in bringing things into close proximity to one another, right? So the meaning doesn't reside in the object itself, but the meaning is produced when you sort of like bring things together in close proximity to one another to draw out certain poetics of, say, relation, so that so that new meanings can sort of like emerge out of that uh, the point of proximity, for example. And I feel like that is maybe something worth thinking about, or thinking thinking alongside with as a methodology, not to sort of like always just think of meaning as solely residing within the object itself or the singular artifact itself, but actually when we do art history, whether we do art history, whether we sort of like make art, or whether we are sort of like existing as curator, it is true relationship. It is true sort of like finding out the relationship that we produce new meaning of the story that we want to tell. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was a really fantastic way to end, like a note to end on as well. But if everyone could just join me in thanking Simon so much.
Thank you, everyone.